We have to take the word of anonymous authors decades later and thousands of miles away.
Anonymous Gentile Greek authors thousands of miles away wrote the Gospels, right? Okay. How did the anonymous Gentile Greek authors thousands of miles away know about the Korban rule in Mark 7? How did they know about the rabbinic washing of the hands, cups, pots, vessels, and couches Jews did when they came back from the marketplaces? You can't find that in the Old Testament because these traditions were only part of the first century oral law that only Second Temple Jews in Israel would know. They weren't written down yet till the 2nd century. Also, the Pharisees during the time of Jesus believed in the end-time resurrection, but the Sadducees did not because they only read the first 5 books of Moses. So you're telling me Greek Gentile authors knew enough about the different sects of Second Temple Judaism to geniusly craft a fake story of Jesus refuting the Sadducees in Mark 12 by only using the first 5 books of Moses instead of quoting Daniel or Isaiah and going the easy route to prove the resurrection? An anonymous Greek Gentile author thousands of miles away, you're telling me their first instinct when it comes to having Jesus answer the question of what is the most important commandment was to say, Shema Israel Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad? Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. The Shema? Really? I could give you many more examples, but this becomes so obvious when you compare the canonical Gospels with the fake apocryphal Gospels. Everyone listen to me. Just read the Gospel of Thomas, read the Gospel of Peter, read the infancy Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, etc. They don't have any details about Second Temple Judaism like this at all because they're clearly not eyewitnesses. I said this in another video, and I'll say it again. I challenge any person that really wants to dig their heels in that the Gospels are not eyewitnesses. This is fact. Can all the scholars really be wrong? Who are you, some anonymous prophet? Don't you know throughout history that the people always listen to the true prophets? All right, I'm doing too much. But in all seriousness, do a public social experiment and recreate these exact conditions you're so confident about. Go into the streets and test random Gentiles with a notebook, a pen, and the Hebrew scriptures and tell them to write the Gospel of Mark. Remember, just like how you believe, no modern libraries, no Google, no Wikipedia. Or at least tell them to write a convincing story about Jesus. And I promise you, it'll look just like the 2nd century apocryphal Gospels and nothing like Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. Moreover, we as believers have to constantly hear you say, well, the authors of the Gospels don't claim to be eyewitnesses, even though John clearly does, but I'll let that slide since he wrote his Gospel in the 90s. I would be very careful using that as a test for eyewitness, because Luke, the author of Acts, is clearly claiming to be an eyewitness, traveling with Paul to Jerusalem in Acts 21, verses 17 and 18, to see James, the brother of Jesus, and all of the elders. I mean, let's be honest. If you had a time machine and you could travel to any church throughout history to learn about Jesus, which church could possibly be better than the very first church in Jerusalem, led by James, the very brother of Jesus, the very first overseer ever, when all of the elders were present? If you're going to make a big fuss about gospel authors not claiming to be eyewitnesses, are you equally going to make as big of a fuss about the same person that wrote and claimed to take this trip to Jerusalem is also the same person who outright claims that it was eyewitnesses that delivered the previous gospels to him? In all honesty, the nail in the coffin is the book of Acts. Regardless of anyone's views about Christianity, it's perfectly clear that the author is trying to give a very comprehensive account on the history of Christianity. He's trying so hard not to miss any details that he literally starts his book right after the resurrection. Yet, the book of Acts does not include the stoning of James, the brother of Jesus, in 62 AD, the crucifixion of Peter, and beheading of Paul in the mid-60s, Emperor Nero ripping Christians apart by lions and lighting them on fire as a light show, and the destruction of the temple in 70 AD? Why? Because it was obviously written beforehand. Unless you subscribe to the view that, well, no, Luke was purposely trying to just look early in an attempt to trick 21st century Gentiles into thinking he was early. Guys, let's just say for the sake of argument, even though I don't agree with it at all, Acts really did come out in the 80s, and the scholars are right. The Gospel of Luke, Matthew, and Mark were already out. It would not have changed anything significant at all to Christianity to include all those details. That's why it's nonsense to place it after them. So in conclusion, if Acts is before 62 AD, then Luke, Matthew, Mark were earlier, and by eyewitnesses, which makes sense because according to Luke, who was in Jerusalem with Paul and James and the rest of the elders, the first Gospels were by eyewitnesses and given to Luke. That would explain why there's parts of Matthew and Mark in Luke. Therefore, the anonymous gospel theory is over. Repent and believe in the Lord Yeshua because 2030 is at hand.